The November election hadn't even been close. Lindbergh got 57% of the popular vote, and in an electoral sweep carried 46 states, losing only FDR's home state of New York, and by a mere 2,000 votes, Maryland, where the large population of federal office workers had voted overwhelmingly for Roosevelt, while the president was able to retain, as he could nowhere else below the Mason-Dixon line, the loyalty of nearly half the Democrats' old Southern constituency. Though on the morning after the election, disbelief prevailed, especially among the pollsters, by the day after that, everybody seemed to understand everything, and the radio commentators and the news columnists made it sound as if Roosevelt's defeat had been preordained. What had happened, they explained, was that Americans had shown themselves unwilling to break the tradition of the two-term presidency that George Washington had instituted, and that no president before Roosevelt had dared to challenge. Moreover, in the aftermath of the Depression, the resurgent confidence of young and old alike had been quickened by Lindbergh's relative youth and by the graceful athleticism that contrasted so starkly with the serious physical impediments under which FDR labored as a polio victim. And there was the wonder of aviation and the new way of life it promised. Lindbergh, already the record-breaking master of long-distance flight, could knowledgeably lead his countrymen into the unknown of the aeronautical future, while assuring them by his straight-laced, old-fashioned demeanor that modern engineering achievements need not erode the values of the past. It turned out, the experts concluded, that 20th century Americans, weary of confronting new crisis in every decade, were starving for normalcy, and what Charles A. Lindbergh represented was normalcy raised to heroic proportions. A decent man with an honest face and an undistinguished voice, who had resoundingly demonstrated to the entire planet the courage to take charge and the fortitude to shape history, and of course the power to transcend personal tragedy. If Lindbergh promised no war, then there would be no war. For the great majority it was as simple as that. Even worse for us than the election were the weeks following the inauguration, when the new American president traveled to Iceland to meet personally with Adolf Hitler, and after 2 days of cordial talks to sign an understanding guaranteed peaceful relations between Germany and the United States. There were demonstrations against the Iceland understanding in a dozen American cities, and impassioned speeches on the floor of the House and the Senate by Democratic congressmen who survived the Republican landslide and who condemned Lindbergh for dealing with the murderous fascist tyrant as his equal and for accepting as their meeting place an island kingdom whose historic allegiance was to a democratic monarchy whose conquest the Nazis had already achieved, a democratic tragedy for Denmark, plainly deplorable to the people and their king, but one that Lindbergh's Reykjavik visit appeared tacitly to condone. When the President returned from Iceland to Washington, a flight formation of 10 large Navy patrol planes escorting the new 2-engine Lockheed Interceptor that he himself piloted home. His address to the nation was a mere 5 sentences long. It is now guaranteed that this great country will take no part in the war in Europe. That was how the historic message began, and this is how it was elaborated and concluded. We will join no warring party anywhere on this globe. At the same time, we will continue to arm America and train our young men in the armed forces in the use of the most advanced military technology. The key to our invulnerability is the development of American aviation, including rocket technology. This will make our continental borders unassailable to attack from without, while maintaining our strict neutrality. 10 days after the President signed the Hawaii Understanding in Honolulu with Prince Fumimaro Konoe, Premier of the Japanese Imperial Government, and Foreign Minister Matsuko, as emissaries of Emperor Hirohito, the two had already signed a triple alliance with Germany and the Italians in Berlin in September of 1940. The Japanese endorsing the new order in Europe established under the leadership of Italy and Germany, who in turn endorsed the new order in Greater East Asia established by Japan. The three countries further pledged to support one another militarily should any of them be attacked by a nation not engaged in the European or Sino-Japanese War. Like the Iceland Understanding, the Hawaii Understanding made the United States party in all but name to the Axis Triple Alliance by extending American recognition of Japan's sovereignty in East Asia and guaranteeing the United States would not oppose Japanese expansion on the Asian continent, including the annexation of the Netherlands, Indies, and French Indochina. Japan pledged to recognize U.S. sovereignty on its own continent, to respect the political independence of the American Commonwealth of the Philippines, scheduled to be enacted in 1946, and to accept the American territories of Hawaii, Guam, and Midway as permanent U.S. possessions in the Pacific. In the aftermath of the understandings, Americans everywhere went about declaiming, "No war, no young men fighting and dying ever again. Lindbergh can deal with Hitler," they said, and Hitler respects him because he's Lindbergh. Mussolini and Hirohito respect him because he's Lindbergh. The only ones against him, the people said, are the Jews, and certainly that was true in America. All the Jews could do was worry. Our elders on the street speculated incessantly about what they would do to us, and whom we could rely on to protect us, and how we might protect ourselves. The younger kids, like me, came home from school frightened and bewildered, and even in tears because of what older boys had been telling one another about what Lindbergh had said about us to Hitler and what Hitler had said about us to Lindbergh during their meals together in Iceland. One reason my parents decided to keep our long-laid plans to Washington was to convince Sandy and me, whether or not they themselves believed it, that nothing had changed other than that FDR was no longer in office. America wasn't a fascist country and wasn't going to be, regardless of what Alvin had predicted. There was a new president and a new Congress, but each was bound to follow the law as set down in the Constitution. They were Republican, they were isolationists, and among them, yes, there were anti-Semites, as indeed there were among the Southerners in FDR's own party, but that was a long way from being Nazis. Besides, one had only to listen on Sunday nights to Winchell lashing out at the new president and his friend Joe Goebbels, or hear him listing sites under consideration by the Department of the Interior for building concentration camps, sites mainly located in Montana, the home state of Lindbergh's National Unity Vice President, the isolationist Democrat Burton K. Wheeler, to be assured of the fervor with which the new administration was being scrutinized by favorite reporters of my father's life, like Winchell and Dorothy Thompson and Quentin Reynolds and William I. Schreier, and of course the staff of PM. Even I now took my turn with PM when my father brought it home at night, not just to read the comic strip Barnaby or to flip through the pages of photographs, but to have in my hands documentary proof that despite the incredible speed with which our status as Americans appeared to be altering, we were still living in a free country. After Lindbergh was sworn into office on January 20th, 1941, FDR returned with his family to their estate at Hyde Park, New York, and hadn't been seen or heard from, because it was as a boy in Hyde Park that he had first become interested in collecting stamps when his mother, as the story went, had passed on to him her own childhood albums. I imagined him there spending all of his time arranging the hundreds of specimens that he had accumulated during his 8 years in the White House. As every collector knew, no president before him had ever commissioned his Postmaster General to issue so many new stamps, nor had there been another American president so intimately involved with the Post Office Department. Practically my first goal when I got my album was to accumulate all of the stamps that I knew FDR had a hand in designing or had personally suggested, beginning with the 1936 three-cent Susan B. Anthony stamp commemorating the 60th anniversary of the Women's Suffrage Amendment, and the 1937 5-cent Virginia Dare stamp marking the birth at Roanoke 350 years earlier of the first English child born in America. The 1934 3-cent Mother's Day stamp, designed originally by FDR and displaying in the left-hand corner the legend, "In memory and honor of the mothers of America," and to the right of center the artist Whistler's celebrated portrait of his mother, was given to me in a block of 4 by my own mother to help get my collection going. She'd also contributed to my purchasing the 7 commemorative stamps Roosevelt had approved in his first year as president, which I wanted because, prominently displayed on 5 of them, was 1933, the year I was born. Before we went to Washington, I asked permission to take my stamp album on the trip, out of fear that I would lose it and be heartbroken afterward. My father at first said no, but then allowed him, or my mother at first said no, but then allowed herself to be won over when I insisted on the necessity of at least having with me my presidential stamps, the 16, that is, that I owned of the 1938 set that progressed sequentially by denomination from George Washington to Calvin Coolidge, the 1922 Arlington National Cemetery stamp, and the 1923 Lincoln Memorial and Capitol Building stamps were far too expensive for my budget. But I nonetheless offered as another reason for taking my collection along that the 3 famous sites were clearly pictured in black and white on the album pages reserved for them. In fact, I was afraid to leave the album at home because in our empty flat of the nightmare I'd had, afraid that either because I'd done nothing about removing the 10-cent Lindbergh airmail stamp from my collection, or because Sandy had lied to our parents and his Lindbergh drawings remained intact under his bed, or because of the one filial betrayal conspiring with the other, a malignant transformation would occur in my absence, causing my unguarded Washingtons to turn into Hitlers and swastikas to be imprinted on my national parks. And we'll pause there.